Illegal drug markets. We've had videos on the alcohol industry structure, the pharmaceutical industry structure, but even though illicit drugs are sold in a very unique way compared to licit drugs, to legal drugs, there's still some market structure involved with them. Now, I will freely admit that when I was growing up and I heard terms such as the black market, I thought there was actually like a physical market somewhere out there. And I was very disappointed to learn that there is no place where all these criminals, all these drug users, all these mobs come together and sell their wares and buy different things. I was very disappointed that didn't happen. It would have been a fun field trip. But there are still marketplaces. So for the illegal drug market, the virtual marketplace is any relationship between the buyer and seller. This can be a phone call, this can be a text message, this can be an email, this can be an online transaction. But there's also a physical marketplace. And a physical marketplace is any actual location where transactions are made. So someone on the street corner, an actual marketplace. Maybe there really is a black market out there and I just haven't been able to find it. Now, illegal drugs are typically sold in virtual marketplaces. So over the phone, by text, that's where the actual agreement takes place, even if the product themselves switch hands in different circumstances. Now, these drug markets, these illegal drug markets, have three key features: form, price, and product quality. Regarding form, the illegal drug market is largely decentralized. It's made up of hundreds and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of different individuals at different levels in the marketplace. The idea that there are only a few large cartels out there controlling the entire drug market for a specific drug, so a cartel just for cocaine or a cartel just for heroin, is simply untrue. It's a myth. It's also decentralized because they can't use the justice system to settle disputes. And there's really no written records. So this actually, because of these two things, that limits how big any one part of the market can actually be. If there's no legal recourse to beat back a competitor, you have to physically beat back them, and usually that's pretty bad for business. So you have millions of people involved, from small to large, and I do want to stress that even though there's no central cartels controlling the drug trade for any particular illicit drug, you do have larger organizations than others. But it is a very long chain, so the people who are the growers are far removed from the people who are actually selling the product. And you may only know the next person up in the chain. So a grower may only know the first person in the distribution chain. And that first distributor may only know the person to get it the product across a country border. And the seller, the final seller, may only know the consumer and the person who got the product into the country. So any one person who's part of this marketplace will not know all of the other players in the marketplace. This is an example of the opiate distribution network in the world, essentially how heroin is trafficked and other natural opiates are trafficked throughout the world. There are three main production centers. So you have heroin production in the Western Hemisphere, primarily in Mexico and Colombia. You have high rates of heroin production in Afghanistan, and then you also have some being trafficked out of Southeast Asia and Myanmar and Laos. The products being produced in Latin America and Mexico and in Colombia are mainly meant for the United States. They're mainly meant for North America. Those in Afghanistan are mainly meant for the countries around Afghanistan, Europe, African continent, as well as Russia and other parts of Asia. And then the Southeast Asian products are mainly end up in China. And all of the other lines in there are basically the routes that these products can take. It's not that these products can only exist in certain countries. Like, Afghanistan opiates only occur or only purchased and consumed in Europe, but the majority of them, that's where they end up. And for Afghanistan in particular, all of the countries surrounding them in pink are the countries where the products are trafficked through. So in these countries, these are the countries where the drug actually has to go through before ending up with the consumer. So Heroin is a good example, or the opiates are a good example of how decentralized it can actually be. You have growers in multiple countries, you have multiple ways to get the product around the world, you have multiple countries the product has to go through to get around the world, and then you have multiple consumers. But despite all of that complexity and all the different players involved, you still have structure. You still have this chain between the producers at the top selling, moving the product down to consumers, and then the consumers supplying money back to the producers. So there is still a structure involved, even though it's highly decentralized. Now, there are some pros and cons of this decentralized network. Now, from the public health perspective, some of the cons are that it is highly resilient and highly adaptable. Essentially, whatever we do to one part, there's going to be someone else to fill the void. We could take away as many distributors as we want, as many producers as we want, as many sellers as we want. Someone else is going to fill that void, either locally or someone from outside the current region. And that makes these systems, these networks, extraordinarily difficult to fully eliminate, which is some of the issues why we haven't really, why the drug wars, for instance, weren't successful. But there are some pros as well. So because it's so decentralized, because they have to exist outside the law, they can't really innovate. They can't reinvest their profit into developing new and more addictive products because they don't have the resources to do so. The decentralization decreases the efficiency in which they can produce the product, it decreases the efficiency at which they can distribute the product, and the cost increases there at each stage of distribution. So between production, it might go through dozens of different people in terms of distribution until it gets to the seller, until it gets to the consumer. And at each stage, the price gets marked higher and higher. And the higher the cost is at the end, the less the product is going to be consumed. So decentralization, or a decentralized illegal drug market, is very hard to eliminate, but it's also very difficult to expand. And by expand, I mean offer new pharmaceuticals or new drugs, at low cost. So new drugs at low cost. So that was form. Now price. Now, illegal drugs are expensive. They are very expensive, particularly compared to legal alternatives. So a cigarette costs more than a joint you buy in the street. Now this might change with the legalization of recreational marijuana use, but illegal marijuana still costs well more than a cigarette. Alcohol costs way less than heroin, for instance. Alcohol is legal, heroin is not. And these costs, these higher costs, is a reflection of that these products are illegal, the risks of distribution, and the decentralized structure of the illegal drug industry, of the illegal drug market. So because it's illegal, there are extra risks involved. Someone might get caught, they might have to serve jail time, and these are high risks. There are some companies, Singapore, for instance, the penalty isn't jail time, the penalty is death. So with increased risks come increased it costs more to get someone to accept those risks. But drug prices aren't constant, they do vary, so drugs themselves tend to be higher in more developed countries than in less developed countries. Drugs will be more expensive the further removed from production than consumption. So if we go back to that opioid map, the heroin produced in Mexico will be more expensive than the heroin produced in Colombia if consumed in the United States because Mexico is closer, and those will be cheaper. So the heroin produced in Mexico will be less expensive than the heroin produced in Colombia, and the heroin produced in Mexico and Colombia will be less expensive than the heroin produced in Afghanistan, because the heroin produced in Afghanistan has had to go through more countries, it's had to travel a longer distance, and there's more separation between where the product is produced and where it's ultimately consumed. So the larger distance, the more expensive it's going to be, the more developed a country is, the more expensive the drug is going to be. And finally, product quality. So most of these products on the illegal drug market are actually relatively low quality. There's no regulations, and there's no ability for a consumer to enforce kind of the informal contract of, I'm giving you money to give me exactly what I expect. On top of that, drugs are often cut with something else to reduce the potency. So maybe the distributor or the final seller got a high quality product, but they're going to cut it with something else to make it even more profitable. They can double the number of transactions and they can double their profits. This diluting effect and whatever consequences are typically completely unknown to the buyer. Again, they have no recourse. They can't have the product tested before they buy it. It's an illegal drug. They have to do it right on the spot. But there is another side effect, or another consequence of this. Sometimes drugs aren't diluted, but they're actually made more potent by cutting it with other psychoactive substances. So one of the issues now, at least at the moment that's hitting the news, is that heroin is often being cut with fentanyl, which is a much more powerful opioid than heroin. Fentanyl itself is about 50 times more potent than morphine. A derivative of that, carfentanil, is about 100 times more potent than morphine. So when heroin is cut with fentanyl or carfentanil, essentially those products are added to heroin without the consumer's knowledge, the risk for overdose increases dramatically, and the risk of death from overdose increases dramatically. Because again, the consumer, the last person in this chain, isn't even aware and can't be aware that the product they're buying isn't a pure substance.